Lesson 64, the interrogative pronoun quis, questions and answers, Caesar, Book 1, Chapter 8, concluded. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 189, and we're going to talk about questions, how to ask questions in Latin. And as part of that, we're going to talk about how to say who or what. You know, if you wanted to go up to an ancient Roman and say, who is that over there? Or what's that? How would you do it? What words would you use? So let's take a look at section 497 and 498, and you'll see there that we have the interrogative pronoun in section 497, and then in 498 we have the interrogative adjective. So you may ask, why do we have an interrogative pronoun and an interrogative adjective? Why would they be two different words when many of the other pronouns we've seen also double as adjectives? For example, ille. Ille is a demonstrative that can be either a demonstrative adjective or a pronoun. It can stand alone. You know, you can say ille did something, meaning that guy, or you could put a noun with it and say ille vir, that man. So if you say ille vir, then the word vir means man, and ille means that. And so there, the word ille is acting as an adjective, a demonstrative adjective. But if you just say ille, and it means that in the sense of that guy, there it is a pronoun. It has substance to it. It's not just an adjective. It can stand in for a noun. Same thing with hic haec hoc, which means this. Same thing with is ea id. You can even do that with ipse. You can do it with idem. All those pronouns like that can be either pronouns or adjectives. The only difference is whether or not they have a noun attached to them. All those words, they can stand alone and be a pronoun, or you can put a noun with it, and then grammatically, you would consider it to be an adjective. So we might say that all those words wear two hats. They wear the hat of a pronoun, and they wear the hat of an adjective. You might say they do double duty. They're the hardest working pronouns in show business because they're doing two jobs. There is no separate word to be a pronoun and then another separate word to be the adjective form. It's just the same form for both. But in this lesson, we're seeing something different. We're seeing that if you want to have an interrogative pronoun, that's the way it is in section 497. You have quis and quid, but if you want to put a noun with it, then it's an interrogative adjective, and you put different words with it. So in 497, quis and quid are just pronouns. They're not going to double as adjectives. And here's an example of what I mean. Here's a sentence in which I have an interrogative pronoun. The interrogative pronoun is going to have substance, and it's going to stand in for a noun. So here it is. Who washed the car? In that sentence, the word who is an interrogative pronoun. It has substance. It does not have any noun attached to it. It's not modifying anything. It's just standing alone, so it's an interrogative pronoun. In Latin, if you want to ask a question like that, you would use what you see in 497, quis or quid. But if I want to ask that same question and I want to put a noun with the interrogative, I might say something like, what person washed the car? In English, we can't use the word who as an adjective. We can't say, who person washed the car? That doesn't make any sense. But you can say things like which or what. You can say, which person washed the car? What person washed the car? In those examples, the word person is a noun, and which or what is an adjective modifying that noun. So which person, what person? In those examples, the words which and what are interrogative adjectives because they have a noun with them. They're describing a noun. So quick review, an interrogative pronoun stands alone. Who washed the car? An interrogative adjective has a noun attached to it. What person washed the car? Which person washed the car? So that's the difference between section 497 and 498. One is an interrogative pronoun, one is an interrogative adjective. The interrogative adjectives described in 498 are the same as the relative pronouns that you already know. They decline the same as the relative pronouns. So you can take those words and pair them up with some noun and ask a question that way. If you want to say, what man washed the car? In Latin, you could say, qui vir, what man, or which man. Qui, quae, quod, masculine, feminine, neuter. If you want to say, what woman washed the car? You would say, quae femina. You'd need to use the feminine form, and then quod for neuter. So qui vir washed the car, what man washed the car, quae femina washed the car, what woman washed the car. Back to 497, what if you just want to say who as an interrogative pronoun? In that case, you have what you see here in this paradigm chart. For nominative, we have quis and quid. Quis is masculine and feminine. Quid is neuter. In Latin, the neuter gender is associated with inanimate objects. So quid, being neuter, maps more onto our English word what. Quis, being either masculine or feminine, maps onto our English word who. So this is one of those areas where natural gender will affect your choice. If you're talking about a person and you want to know the identity of a person, you would say quis. Quis is that person over there. But if you want to know what an object is, you would not say quis, you would say quid, because the use of quid as a neuter gender interrogative suggests an inanimate object, a thing. So if a person walks in the room and you say to your friend, who is that? You could say, quis est. If your friend is holding some new gadget and you want to say, what's that? You could say, quid est. What is it? For all three genders, the genitive form is quis. And since it's genitive, it can show possession in the sense of who. Of course, with correct grammar, we would say of whom. Or we can say whose, W-H-O-S-E. So if a shiny new car pulls up, you might say, whose car is that? Meaning of whom. It's the car of whom. So in Latin, you would say quis. Of whom is the car? For dative, it's qui. If someone brings in a Christmas present and you want to say, for whom is that gift? You could say qui. Qui, for whom? If it's a direct object in a sentence, for example, if your friend saw someone, you could say to your friend, whom did you see? In Latin, that would be quim. Or if it's what did you see, it would be quid. Why? Because in that sentence, the word whom is the direct object. You saw whom. So when it's a direct object like that, you need to use quim or quid. Of course, in English, we have who and whom. We're supposed to use who when it's a subject and whom when it's a direct object or object of a preposition. But a lot of people don't do that anymore. A lot of people just say who. But, grammatically speaking, you're supposed to say whom. And then for the ablative, you have quo, and that can do all the things that an ablative can do. With whom, by whom. Quo in the neuter can mean by means of what. So these are interrogative pronouns. They ask questions, but as you are putting together the question that you want to ask, you have to keep in mind, what role is that word playing in the sentence? Is it asking who the recipient of something is? Then you need qui in the dative. Is it asking of whom something is? You'll need the genitive, quis. If it's the subject of a sentence, who is that? Then you'll need quis. So with interrogative pronouns, you have to think about what the role is that word is playing in the sentence, and then you have to pick the correct interrogative for that. So you have to think of case and the kind of question you're asking and the role that pronoun is playing in the sentence. Okay, quick review. An interrogative pronoun would be quis, as in, who is that? It's standing alone, and so it's a pronoun. If you pair it up with a noun and say, what man, that would be qui vir. And so now it's an interrogative adjective because it has a noun with it. So again, take note of the difference between the interrogative pronoun and the interrogative adjective. One last thing, at the very end of section 497, it says the plural is like that of the relative qui. So the quis quid stuff that we just covered in section 497, that is for the singular. In the plural, the interrogative pronoun is just like qui, quod. So that's an important note, that quis quid is singular, but then for plurals, it's just like in section 498. There's no difference between the interrogative pronoun and the interrogative adjective. Let's go on now to section 499, and let's talk about questions in Latin. How can we ask questions in different ways? Ways that expect the answer yes, ways that expect the answer no, or ways that don't expect any kind of answer. You can do all three of those things in Latin, and in fact, we do the same thing in English. In English, we can ask a question in such a way that shows that we want or expect the answer to be yes, other ways where we want or expect the answer to be no, and in other ways, we can just simply ask a question that doesn't expect any answer. So in English, how might I ask a question that expects the answer to be yes? A couple of ingredients can go into this. One is intonation of the voice, the pitch of your voice. Another is extra helper words like the word right. If I say, you washed the car, right? Or you washed the car, didn't you? When I ask those questions, it's pretty clear that I'm expecting the answer to be yes. But what if I'm expecting or wanting the answer to be no? What could I say then? I could say something like this. You didn't wash the car, did you? When I phrase it in that kind of way, it's clear that I'm expecting or wanting the answer to be no. So if I expect or want the answer to be yes, I'll say, you washed the car, right? Or, you washed the car, didn't you? But if I expect or want the answer to be no, I could say, you didn't wash the car, did you? If I'm not expecting any answer, or not wanting any particular answer, I could just say, did you wash the car? And I could make my voice go up at the end like this. Did you wash the car? If I say it like that, it's clear that I'm not really expecting a yes or a no. I'm just simply asking a question and wanting some kind of answer from the person I'm talking to. So in English, we can ask a question in such a way that expects or wants a yes, or that expects or wants a no, or that has no preference. We're not looking for any answer or expecting any answer. We're just simply asking the question. So in section 499, we learn how to say all those kinds of things in Latin. So let's look at the top of page 190 and let's read about how to do this. Look at the second line at the top of page 190. It says, nonne implies the answer yes. Num implies the answer no. And the suffix ne is attached to the end of a word, and that's a signal that you're not expecting any kind of answer. You're just asking a question. So you can take any Latin sentence and just turn it into a question by adding all these words at the beginning of your sentence. At the very beginning of the sentence, You can put in the word nonne. You can put in the word num. You can attach the suffix ne to the first word of the sentence. You can do all three of those things to signal to your listener that you're starting off a question. And really, if you look at the word nonne, you can see that that's really just the Latin word non, which means not, with the ne suffix attached to it. So let's practice a bit with these. By the way, when it comes to questions, this is a perfect example of how valuable it can be to speak Latin because it gives you lots of practice with this kind of sentence. If you're actually talking to people, you can ask lots of questions and get lots of practice with this kind of thing, and it just becomes natural. So let's practice a bit. Let's have a sentence in which someone is walking to a town. We'll use ambulo, which means to walk, and then oppidum means town. So we'll say ad oppidum, to the town. So if I say to a person, ambulas ad oppidum, ambulas is second person singular, so that says you are walking, and then ad oppidum says to the town. So ambulas ad oppidum, you are walking to the town. So we have a simple sentence. And now let's practice by adding the different question words to it. If we start the sentence with the word nonne, we can make the sentence into a question that expects the answer to be yes. So if I'm in ancient Rome and I want to ask my ancient Roman friend whether or not he or she is walking to a town or to the town, there are different ways I can do it. I can start out the sentence with nonne, and that would mean that I expect the answer to be yes. Nonne ambulas ad oppidum. That would translate to, you're walking to the town, right? That is asking the question in such a way that it expects the answer to be yes. So it means something like, you're walking to the town, aren't you? Or, you're walking to the town, right? Again, the word nonne is just the word not, but with a question ending, that special ne suffix. So the word nonne in Latin strikes me as something like, are you not? Like in English, if we say, are you not walking to the town? That's kind of an archaic way to ask the question, but it helps you to see kind of a glimpse of what nonne is really comprised of. It's kind of like, are you not? Are you not doing this? Or are you not doing that? So nonne is a signal that you're asking a question and you expect or want the answer to be yes. If you expect or want the answer to be no, you can start out your sentence with num. Let's try this. Num ambulas ad oppidum. That would translate to, you're not walking to the town, are you? So when you phrase it that way, you're expecting the answer to be no. Num ambulas ad oppidum. And then, if you want to ask the question in just a general way, in which you're not expecting any answer, you can just tag the ne suffix to the first word of the sentence. It doesn't matter what the first word is. It can be pretty much anything. You just take the first word and you tag on the ne suffix. So if I'm saying ambulas ad oppidum, I'll just add ne and say ambulasne ad oppidum. And that just says, are you walking to the town? It's merely asking a question without expecting any kind of certain answer. Okay, so quick review. Nonne means you expect or want the answer to be yes. Nonne ambulas ad oppidum. You're walking to the town, right? Num expects or wants the answer to be no. Num ambulas oppidum. You're not walking to the town, are you? And then the ne suffix attached to the first word of the sentence doesn't expect a yes or a no. Ambulasne ad oppidum. Are you walking to the town? So that's a quick introduction to Latin questions. And we have some example sentences here on page 190. Let's go over those together. These questions involve all the things we learned above about interrogative pronouns, interrogative adjectives, nonne, num, and ne. So let's just practice our questions by going through these example sentences here on page 190. Number 1 says, quis conjurationem fecit. Here, quis is an example of an interrogative pronoun. It doesn't have any adjective attached to it. It's just meaning who. If we wanted to say what made the conspiracy, like some kind of inanimate object, we would say quid conjurationem fecit. But since we're talking about a person, we'll use the masculine and feminine form, which is quis. That's a signal that we're referring to a human being. Fecit is the verb facio in the perfect tense, third person singular. And then conjurationem is the third declension noun conjuratio, which means conspiracy. So number 1 says, who made the conspiracy? In number 2, we have an interrogative adjective. Notice that qui is paired up with a noun. That's Helvetius. That means a Helvetian person. So qui Helvetius says, what Helvetian? Instead of saying quis Helvetius, we don't use quis as an adjective. We say qui instead. So here's an example of how you use an interrogative adjective instead of an interrogative pronoun. Qui Helvetius, that's an interrogative adjective plus a noun. What Helvetian made the conspiracy? In number 3, there is no explicitly stated subject. Fecit just means he, she, or it made. And so the subject of the sentence is just the pronoun he, she, or it. The word ubi can mean when or where. In this particular case, it means where. So number 3 says, where did he, she, or it make the conspiracy? In number 4, we see the ne suffix attached to the first word of the sentence, signaling a question. And it's signaling a question that does not expect any kind of certain answer. It doesn't expect a yes or a no. So that first word is gallus, which means a Gallic person. It's really a substantive adjective. So gallus is the subject. That means a Gallic person. Here it's got the masculine us ending, so it means a Gallic man. So a Gallic man made the conspiracy. That's the basic content of the sentence. But with the ne suffix attached to the first word, that turns it into a question. And so it becomes, did a Gallic man make the conspiracy? Or as they say here in their translation, did a Gaul make a conspiracy? In number 5, nonne, as the first word, signals that the person is asking a question and that the person asking wants or expects the answer to the question to be yes. So, nonne conjurationem fecit, that means something like, he made a conspiracy, right? Or, he made a conspiracy, didn't he? Again, it's expecting or wanting the answer to be yes. In number 6, num starts out the sentence. That's a signal that the person is asking a question and that the person asking expects or wants the answer to be no. So, num conjurationem fecit says, he didn't make a conspiracy, did he? Let's go on now to section 500, and let's talk about answers, meaning answers to questions. If someone asks you a question in Latin, how can you answer the question? So let's take a look here. It says, a question may be answered by repeating the verb. Okay, let's stop there. What does it mean to repeat the verb? Let's use our example sentence again, the one about walking to the town. Let's say someone says to you, ambulasne ad oppidum? Are you walking to the town? You can repeat the verb back. You can say, ambulo. So if they say, are you walking to the town? You can say, I am walking. And so in that way, you're answering the question by repeating the verb. Or if you're not walking to the town, you can say, non ambulo. But in doing so, that is, in repeating back the verb that they used, you can answer the question. Continuing on, it says, or by using the words certe, etiam, ita, non, minime. So certe is an adverb that means certainly. We have the first and second declension adjective, certus, certa, certum. So certe is an adverb. So if someone says to you, nonne ambulas ad oppidum, you're walking to the town, aren't you? You could say certe, certainly. You could say ita, and in responding like that, you would be saying something like, it is so, or it is thus, it is as you say, something like that. If you say non here, I guess that's short for non ambulo. So by saying non, it would be saying I am not walking with the repeated verb understood. I don't know. I have not personally seen that in texts. Minime is a good one to know. That's a superlative adverb. Minimus, minima, minimum. Well, we have our English word minimum. It means the least, right? So minimus, minima, minimum means least. It's a superlative. So if you have an adverbial version of that, minime, it means something like in the least of all fashion. Leastly of all. We don't have the word leastly in English, but that's what it's saying. It's adverbial, that is describing a verb, saying in the least possible fashion. So it's a strong way to say no, not at all, by no means, is what it means. If someone says to you, num ambulas ad oppidum, you're not walking to the town, are you? You could say minime, not at all, or by no means. So we have a few different ways here in Latin to answer a question. By the way, if you're interested in reading Latin texts that involve lots of dialogue, there's a certain kind of text you can go to, and that is the Roman comedies. Roman comedy, as we know it, all stems from an ancient Greek writer named Menander. That's Menander. Menander is known as the father of New Comedy. In ancient Greece, we have Old Comedy and New Comedy. Old Comedy is, for example, the plays of Aristophanes. Aristophanes wrote plays that were silly, filled with bawdy humor, to put it nicely. And so that bawdy sort of lowbrow humor is Old Comedy. That's associated with Aristophanes. Later, we get something called New Comedy. New Comedy is associated with Menander. Menander is considered the father of New Comedy. New Comedy differs from Old Comedy in the sense that it's more like a modern sitcom. It relies heavily on mistaken identities. It doesn't contain a lot of dirty jokes, as we might call it. Instead, it's more situational. It's based on, as I mentioned a moment ago, mistaken identities, people misunderstanding what's going on and then acting silly because they don't understand what someone else is doing. And you also have a lot of what are called stock characters. For example, the brash, bragging soldier, or the forlorn lover, the young man who's in love, or the greedy old father. These are stock characters. And so Roman authors like Plautus and Terence, they would adapt Menander's plays from Greek into Latin. And so we have lots of plays by Plautus. By the way, that's some of the earliest Latin that we have as far as complete texts go. Plautus's plays come from about the 170s BC, I believe. So this is very much before Caesar, more than 100 years before, and even as much as 170 years before someone like Ovid. Then later you get Terence. Terence's style is considered to be really wonderful Latin style. We only have about 6 plays written by Terence. But anyway, the plays of Plautus and Terence are filled with dialogue because they're plays. So people talking to each other. It contains just amazing examples of how Romans might speak to each other. Lots of abbreviations, lots of sentences in which certain words are understood. They're not explicitly said, but just understood. Writing that's done in a very compact kind of way. And you can add to that the fact that they're written in verse. All ancient Greek plays and ancient Roman plays are written in a poetic meter. They're poetry, they're not prose. So they have a certain poetic meter, which can be pretty complicated, actually. So there's a lot going on there. But if you're really interested in speech, dialogue, and hearing ancient Romans talk to each other, you can read the plays of Plautus and Terence, and there's plenty there to keep you busy. In academia, they call that kind of play fabula palliata. The word fabula can mean a story, or it can mean a play, like a stage play. And palliata means dressed up in the pallium, which is an ancient Greek garment. So fabula palliata is a stage play in Greek dress, or something like that. Let's move on to section 501 and talk about direct and indirect questions. So far, we've studied two kinds of indirect discourse that I can think of. We've studied indirect statement, also known as indirect discourse. We've also studied indirect commands. And now there's yet another indirect thing to talk about, and that's indirect questions. So why would we call them indirect questions? What is indirect about them? And that's a good question. It's similar to indirect speech in the sense that it's speech that is being reported to someone secondhand. They're hearing it not from the original speaker, but it's being reported to them by some intermediary. For example, if I'm standing there with my two friends, Fred and Sheila, and Sheila says, "I want some coffee," but I don't hear her because it's noisy. So I turn to Fred and say, "What did she say?" And he might say, "She said that she wants some coffee." So when Sheila originally said that she wants some coffee, that was direct speech. She's just making a statement, "I want some coffee." It's direct discourse, direct speech. But then when Fred tells me what she said, by reporting it secondhand, she said that she wants some coffee. Now, the message of the content of what Sheila said is now being reported to me through an intermediary. It is therefore indirect. It's the same message, it's the same information that Sheila said, it's just being reported to me through a third party. So instead of it coming directly from Sheila to me, it's going indirectly from Sheila to Fred to me. So that's a good way to picture direct and indirect as far as it pertains to speech, direct speech, indirect speech. Here, we're studying indirect questions, and it's largely the same thing. Take a look at the sentence at the end of section 501. It says, "Rogant quis conjurationem fecerit." That sentence says, they are asking who made the conspiracy. So how is it indirect? Well, Sheila might say, "Who made the conspiracy?" And if I don't hear her, I might turn to Fred and say, "What did she say?" And Fred might say, "She's asking, who made the conspiracy?" So in that sense, it's indirect, kind of like an indirect statement. So in a nutshell, it's just a normal question, but it's framed with some kind of verb that talks about asking. And you can see here in section 501, it says, if a question is dependent on a verb, meaning ask, say, see, tell, wonder, it is indirect. Why? Because it's reporting to you, in a sense, it's reporting secondhand what the person is asking. And so the question now is, how does this pertain to us as far as students of Latin grammar? And the answer to that is that the question, when it is in an indirect question, the question has to have a subjunctive verb. And so that's why fecerit here at the end of section 501 That's why that is a perfect tense subjunctive. So you may be wondering here why fecerit is perfect tense subjunctive. We're in primary sequence here. Rogant is present tense. So you may be wondering why fecerit is perfect tense. Doesn't the perfect tense refer to the past? I'll read you a little bit from Allen and Greenow's textbook. This is section 484. It says, in applying the rule for the sequence of tenses, observe whether the main verb is primary or secondary. If the leading verb is primary, the dependent verb must be in the present if it denotes incomplete action, and in the perfect if it denotes completed action. So fecerit here is perfect subjunctive because it's primary sequence, but showing completed action. Continuing on in Allen and Greenough, it says, if the leading verb is secondary, the dependent verb must be in the imperfect if it denotes incomplete action, pluperfect if it denotes completed action. So as you think about the sequence of tenses, don't just think about the tenses themselves. Also think about if the verb in the subjunctive is communicating completed action or incomplete action. That's another piece of the puzzle there. So the perfect subjunctive is how you show completed action in primary sequence. So rogant is present tense, that's primary sequence, and then fecerit is perfect tense subjunctive, continuing on in primary sequence. And furthermore, there's a good note at the very end of section 501. It says, note, indirect questions are noun clauses. So going back to the rogant quis coniurationem fecerit question at the end of 501, the main verb is rogant. They are asking. And so you could think of, you could think of quis coniurationem fecerit as one unit. The question, who made the conspiracy? That whole thing is just one unit, one noun clause, which it really is the direct object of rogant. So they are asking, who made the conspiracy? So in that sense, an indirect question is a noun clause, and as you can see here, it's really the direct object of rogant. So that's a good note to consider for grammatical knowledge. Moving on to section 502, we have a rule. It says an indirect question has its verb in the subjunctive. And we just spoke about that a moment ago, so I think we've got that. Let's move on now to section 503 and look at some vocabulary. Only a few words to look at here. The first one is oculus, which means eye. That's a masculine noun of the second declension. So oculus, oculi. We have English words like ocular. If you have some kind of ocular problem, that means you have some kind of problem with your eye. Next we have judico, judicare, judicawe, judicatum, of the first conjugation, which means to decide or judge. You can see clearly the root word here is present in English words like judicial, also words like adjudication. And finally, fluo, fluere, from the third conjugation. The third and fourth principal parts are fluxi and fluxum. In English, we have the word flux, which means flow or change or instability, perhaps. Also, this word is etymologically related to the Latin word for river, which is flumen. Why? Because a river flows. And also our English word flume, according to the dictionary, a flume, F-L-U-M-E, is a human-made channel for water. So we have lots of English words related to fluo. Let's move on now to section 504, and let's do our translation exercises for this lesson. Go ahead and turn off the recording and do all the exercises, and when you're ready, turn the recording back on, and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your homework assignment here in section 504. Let's go over the exercises together, starting with number 1. Number 1 says, Galliane incolatur. Here, the subject of the sentence is Gallia, which is the place known as Gaul. It's a feminine noun of the first declension. The verb incolo means to inhabit or to dwell in. So incolatur is third person, singular, and it's passive. So incolatur says he, she, or it is inhabited, or he, she, or it is dwelt in, something like that. So Gallia incolatur, Gallia is inhabited, but it's in the form of a question. Notice the ne suffix tagged on to the word Gallia. That's a signal that the person saying this sentence is asking a question. And the speaker is not expecting any certain answer. The speaker is simply posing the question, is Gaul inhabited? Number 2 is next. Qui incolunt Galliam. As we covered a bit earlier, actually at the beginning of this lesson, there is a difference between interrogative pronouns and interrogative adjectives in the singular, but in the plural, they're the same. So here we have an interrogative pronoun that is plural, and so qui is masculine plural, and it means who. Again, that's an interrogative pronoun because there's no noun paired with it. It's just simply who. And incolunt means inhabit, and Galliam is the direct object. That's the word Gallia, which we saw also in exercise 1. So number 2 has a plural interrogative pronoun, which is the same as the relative pronoun, and it's asking the question, who inhabits Gaul? Number 3 is next. Num Romani incolunt Galliam. In number 3, the sentence starts with num. That's a signal that the person saying this sentence is asking a question, and the speaker expects or wants the answer to be no. So Romani is the subject, that's Romans. Incolunt means inhabit, that's third person plural, and Galliam means Gaul, that's the direct object, it's in the accusative case. So number 3 says, the Romans don't inhabit Gaul, do they? Number 4 is next. Quis apud Helvetios fuit nobilissimus. Again, we have an interrogative pronoun, quis, that's masculine or feminine, so it's probably referring to a human being. So we'll translate it as who. The preposition apud can mean things like at or perhaps among. So apud Helvetios probably means something like among the Helvetii. Fuit means was, that's perfect tense, and nobilissimus is a superlative adjective. It means most noble in the sense of most aristocratic, most high class in the sense of high social rank. Quick review, superlative adjectives decline as first and second declension adjectives. So it's nobilissimus, nobilissima, nobilissimum. So number 4 says, who among the Helvetii was most noble? Or who among the Helvetii was the most noble? Number 5 is next. None Helvetii omnia sua opida incenderunt. This sentence starts out with the word none. That's really non with the special ne suffix. It means something like, didn't he or didn't she? Something like that. It signals that the speaker of this question expects or wants the answer to be yes. The subject is Helvetii. Incenderunt is perfect tense. It means they burned or they set fire to. Opida means towns. That's the direct object. And omnia means all. And sua means their. Their, as in their towns. So number 5, expecting a yes answer, would say something like this. The Helvetii set fire to all their towns, didn't they? Quick review, when you want to say there, T-H-E-I-R, in Latin, you have two choices. You can use suis, sua, suum, which is a first and second declension adjective, or you can use eius, that's E-I-U-S, a genitive form of is, ea, id. How do you know which one to use? Well, if the thing being possessed belongs to the subject of the sentence, you use suis, sua, suum. That's why sometimes you'll see it translated as their own, his own, her own, its own, their own. They put in the word own to try to connect it more to the subject of the sentence. If it's someone other than the subject of the sentence, you use eius. It's referring to someone else. Here, in this sentence, the Helvetii are the subject of the sentence, and the towns are their towns, not someone else's towns, but their own towns. So since the towns are their towns, the way to say that in Latin would be suis, sua, suum. So it means that they set fire to their own towns. If the sentence said omnia eius opida, it would mean that the Helvetii set fire to somebody else's towns. It would be the towns of that guy, or the towns of that person. Or if it's plural, eorum, it would be the towns of those people, meaning someone other than the subject. So that's a good review of the difference between suis, sua, suum, and eius. Moving along to number 6, ubi est genaua. The word ubi can mean when or where. Here it means where. Est means is, and Genaua is a big town just on the south side of the Rhone River in Gallia Narbonensis. Today it's Geneva. So number 6 says, where is Geneva? Number 7 is next. Flumine transire possumus. This sentence is a question. The subject is the word flumen. We just mentioned that noun a few minutes ago when we talked about the verb fluo. It's etymologically related because a river flows, and that's what the verb fluo means. So flumen means river. Transire is trans eo, to go across. It's an infinitive. And then possumus means we are able. Flumen is neuter, but it happens here to be in the accusative case because it's the direct object of transire. Notice that the very first word of this sentence has had a suffix added to it. The ne ending turns any sentence into a question. It doesn't expect any kind of answer. The ne suffix doesn't indicate that you expect the answer to be yes or no. It means that you're just merely posing a question. So that's the word flumen, which means river. It's in the accusative case, and it's got the special ne suffix added to it that turns the sentence into a question. So number 7 says, are we able to cross the river? Number 8 is next. Conabimur si transire possimus. This exercise is very similar to number 7, except for one big difference. It's an indirect question. It's being introduced by conabimur. That's the verb conor, a deponent verb that means to try or attempt. It's future tense, first person plural, so it means we will try, we will attempt. And then we have an indirect question, si transire possimus. Possimus is the verb possum. It's first person plural subjunctive. Remember that the subjunctive forms of sum in the present tense are sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint. I didn't really pronounce that the best possible way. A lot of those I's are long. So here it's possimus, not possumus, because we have a long I there. So possimus is just possumus, first person plural, but it's subjunctive. So it's we are able, but subjunctive. Transire means to cross. That's an infinitive. And let's take a look at these footnotes. They're very helpful. The idea with konabimur here is not, it's not saying we will try to cross. Transire is not working with konabimur. Transire is working as a complementary infinitive with possimus. The idea with konabimur is we will try in the sense of we'll try to see. We're going to test it out. We're going to see if we can do it. That's kind of what's happening here. And then footnote number 2 says, if we are able, in the sense of whether or not we are able. So the sense of it is we will see whether or not we are able to cross. That's really the sense of it. So again, konabimur means try in the sense of test it out. And you may be thinking to yourself, hey, wait a minute. You told me that konor means to try or attempt. So now it means try to see. Well, in English, the word try has that same semantic range. In English, if you say, I'm going to try something new, I'm going to try bowling, it means you're going to attempt it, but it also means you're going to test it out. You're going to test out if bowling is the right activity for you. In a courtroom, if you say, we're going to try a defendant, that means you're going to put that defendant on trial. And a trial is really a test to see guilt or innocence. So the semantic range of konor has, the range of attempting, trying, testing out, evaluating. And our English word try also has that same semantic range. So it's really not unusual that konor would have that ability to express that kind of idea. So the idea here is we're going to test it out if we can cross, in the sense of we're going to see if we can cross. That's really the meaning of what's happening here in number 8. Number 9 is next. In utram partem Rhodanus fluit. So this is a question. The subject is Rhodanus, which is the Rhone River. Fluit is third person singular, present tense of the verb fluo, which means flow. So the subject and verb are the Rhone River flowing. That's what's happening here. So the Rhone River flows, and then in utram partem. I've mentioned this many times, but it bears repeating that the third declension noun partus can have several different meanings. It can mean part, like part of something, like a division. It can mean the side of something, like the side of a mountain. It can mean direction. It can mean a political faction. It just can mean lots of different things. And so in this particular exercise, it means direction. The question is asking, in what direction does the Rhone River flow? And utram is an adjective that means which, in the sense of which out of two. So if you have two choices like left or right, up or down, coffee or tea, if you and your friend are stepping up to a table and someone places 2 pieces of cake there, one is chocolate and one is strawberry, there's 2 of you and there's 2 pieces of cake, you might say to your friend, which one do you want? In the sense of which one out of the 2. Of course, I love cake and I would eat both pieces of cake. Just kidding. But that's the idea here. It's which out of 2 choices. And why is it utram, meaning which out of 2? Because a river can flow in one of 2 directions. It can flow this way or that way. It's just 2 choices, upstream or downstream, I suppose. So number 9 says, as a question, in what direction does the Rhone flow? So we could say, in quim partem, in what direction, and that would be okay too. But when you have utram here, again, that's the first and second declension adjective, uter, utra, utrum, that means which out of 2. So that's more appropriate for when you're asking about a river, because only 2 directions are possible. By the way, uter, utra, utrum is yet another naughty nine adjective. The genitive singular would be utrius, and the dative singular for all three genders would be utri. So that's yet another example of the naughty nine adjectives at work. So number 9 says, in which direction, in the sense of which direction out of the two directions, in which direction does the Rhone flow? Number 10 is next. Oculis in utram partem fluat, judicari non potest. Notice here that fluat is subjunctive. That's the verb fluo, fluere, from the third conjugation. But here, the I in fluit has been replaced with the letter A. So that's showing us that it's subjunctive. Why would it be subjunctive? Because it's an indirect question. The question-y part of this sentence is, in utram partem fluat. In what direction does it flow? So if it were in normal, direct speech, just asking a simple question, it would have fluit. In utram partem fluit. In fact, we saw that very thing in exercise 9. But here it's enclosed inside a larger framing in the sentence. Judicari non potest. Non potest says he, she, or it is not able. And then judicari, that's one of our new verbs for this lesson. It means to decide or judge. You might say discern even. And this is a passive infinitive. It's passive present tense. So judicari, with a long I there at the end, says to be judged. Okay, that's a passive infinitive. So along with non potest, it says it is not able to be judged. In other words, it can't be judged. It can't be discerned. It can't be decided. Oculis, that's another one of our new words for this lesson. That's the second declension oculus, which means eye. And it's ablative plural because it's ablative of means. So oculis, being ablative plural, will say with the eyes or by means of the eyes. So the sentence is basically saying you can't tell just with your eyes alone what's going on. And then what is it that you can't tell with your eyes? What can you not judge with your eyes? You can't judge in what direction it's flowing. This exercise is taken from Caesar's Gallic Wars. In Caesar's Gallic Wars, he talks about a river that flows so slowly or so smoothly that you can't really tell what direction it's flowing in. So it's so motionless in the way it appears to the naked eye that you can't even really tell if it's flowing to your right or to your left. That's what this exercise is referencing. So in regular direct speech, the question here would be, in what direction does it flow? In utram partem fluat. Of course, it would have fluit because it would be indicative. But here, it's encased in this larger framing. So here, it's an indirect question. It is not possible to be judged with the eyes in what direction it flows. Earlier in this lesson, I gave you an example of how to think about indirect questions. And I gave you an example of someone reporting a question to you secondhand. That was just a learning illustration, an illustration to help you learn. When you see indirect questions out in the wild, they're not always like that. They're often just like they are here. They're framed by some larger clause. They're embedded inside some larger clause like, I know what they did, or I know what you did, or I saw what they did. A sentence is like that. If there's a sentence that says, I know what you did, then the direct question would be, what you did. Of course, you would rephrase it as, what did you do? So in that kind of phrase, the part about what you did has an interrogative kind of flavor to it. It sounds very much like a relative clause. I know that thing which you did. But if you'll notice, there's no antecedent. It's not saying, I know the deed which you did. That would be more like a relative clause. Here, if I say, I know what you did, there's no antecedent for the word what to be referring back to. So in that kind of construction, the idea of what you did, it has a question-y sort of interrogative kind of flavor to it. So to me, that's what sets apart an indirect question from a relative clause. So when you're out reading Latin literature and you see an indirect question out in the wild, it very well could be things like, I saw what they did, I know what you did, that kind of construction. And that's what we see here in number 10, is it is not possible to judge in what direction. Encased in that sentence is the question of, in what direction does it flow? So that's the kind of structure you'll see for indirect questions. Number 11 is next. Qualis erat natura montis? This is a question. Qualis means what kind or of what kind. Erat is imperfect. It means was. And natura means something like nature or situation or environment or character, something like that. And then montis means of the mountain. That's genitive singular of the third declension noun mons montis. So number 11 says, of what kind was the nature of the mountain? So the word natura can mean lots of things. In a statement like this, talking about geography, it means, what's the geography of the mountain? Is it steep? Is it pointy? Is it a high mountain? Is it more grassy and flat? That's what they're asking. They're saying, what's the nature of the mountain in the sense of what are its geographical features? So with that explanation in mind, let's just keep the word nature as our translation for natura. A quick note about qualis. We have English words like quality that refer to the kind of something. So that's a good mnemonic for remembering qualis. Moving on to number 12. We have the same thing as in number 11, but now it's going to be reworded into an indirect question. So number 12 says, cognoverunt qualis esset natura montis. So we have an outward framing sentence with the verb cognoverunt. That's the verb cognosco, which means to learn or find out. Cognoverunt is perfect tense. It says they learned or they found out. Now we have the same question as before. What kind or of what quality is the nature of the mountain? But now it's packaged as an indirect question inside this larger sentence. So now the verb changes to a subjunctive verb. It's no longer erat. Now it's imperfect subjunctive, esset. So the core question here still is, qualis esset natura montis? Of what kind was the nature of the mountain? But in the context of the sentence, it's an indirect question because it's being framed with cognoverunt. They learned of what kind was the nature of the mountain. Or perhaps a better English word order, they learned of what kind the nature of the mountain was. Number 13 is next. Num Caesar recintiam injuriarum memoriam deponere potuit. Here we have a question. It starts with the word num. It means that the person asking the question expects or wants the answer to be no. The subject is Caesar, and the verb is potuit. That's possum. It's in the perfect tense. So the subject and verb are Caesar was able. Caesar potuit. Caesar was able. And then deponere, that's the verb depono. That's where we get our English word deponent, right? We've talked about deponent verbs. That's the verb pono, which means to put or place. prefixed with the preposition de, which means from or away, perhaps. So de pono means to put down or put aside, or perhaps set aside. So Caesar, potuit, and de ponere, those three words say Caesar was able to set aside or put aside. The direct object of deponere is memoriam. That means memory. And then we have injuriarum. That means of the injustices. That's the first declension noun, injuria. Remember that injuria doesn't necessarily mean injury. It's really in plus ius. In is a negating part of the word, so it means literally not justice in the sense of injustice. So memoriam and injuriarum will say memory of the injustices. Recentium is an adjective modifying injuriarum. That's a third declension adjective. Recens, which means recent. It's got an I stem genitive plural ending. So recentium injuriarum says of the recent injustices. So Caesar was able to set aside the memory of the recent injustices. That's the content of the sentence, but it's a question, remember? So num starts out the sentence, and it means that the person asking wants or expects the answer to be no. So in English, we might say something like this: Caesar wasn't able to set aside the memory of the recent injustices, was he? Number 14 is next. Quas in partes hostes iter faciunt. This is not an indirect question, it's just a regular old question. So hostes is the subject, faciunt means do or make, that's third person plural, and iter means journey or march. So the enemies are making a march. Iter is the direct object here. And then we have quas in partes. Quas here is an interrogative adjective because it has a noun paired with it. So quas partes, that means what parts, perhaps what directions, what sides. Notice that in is taking the accusative, so it can mean into. So number 14 could say, into what directions are the enemies marching? Of course, we can translate hostes with the collective word, the enemy. So into what directions is the enemy marching? Or it could be talking about parts in the sense of parts of a region, parts of a country. Into what parts of Gaul are the enemies marching? It's hard to tell. We don't have much context here. Number 15 is next. Praemisit exploratores qui viderent quas in partes iter facerent. Here we have three parts of a sentence. Each one is encased inside another, like layers of an onion. So the outer layer of the onion is praemisit exploratores. Let's do that first. Praemisit is the verb mitto, which means send, but it's been prefixed with a preposition. Pri means before. That's the prefix that we get our English prefix pre from. In fact, the word prefix has that very prefix. Prefix has a prefix. So if you preheat your oven, you're doing it before. Somehow the letter A dropped out, so you don't pri-heat your oven, you preheat your oven. And so pri plus mitto has the idea of sending someone in front of you, or sending someone ahead, or sending someone before you. Let's say to send ahead. That might be a good way to do it. And then exploratores is the direct object. That means scouts. It looks very much like our English word explorer. In the Latin third declension, that OR ending is a special ending for a person who does a thing. The OR ending is masculine. If it were a woman doing it, it would be trix. So an explorator would be a male explorer or scout. An exploratrix would be a female scout or a female spy. So explorator is a person who does the act of exploring, and it's got a masculine ending, so it's a male doing it. Exploratrix, same thing, but with a feminine ending. So this is the Roman army. So these are men doing this activity of exploring or scouting or spying. And so exploratores is accusative plural, and that means scouts or spies. There is no explicitly stated subject of this sentence. All we have is primicit. That means he, she, or it sent ahead, or he, she, or it sent in advance, something like that. So what we have so far would say, he, she, or it sent ahead scouts. That's primicit and exploratores. Now we have a relative clause, starting with the relative pronoun qui. But if you'll notice, we have a subjunctive verb in the relative clause. That's the word viderent. That's the verb video, which means to see. Viderent is imperfect subjunctive, and we have a clearly expressed antecedent. What does this start to sound like to you? We haven't seen it in a while. So we have someone being sent to do something. That's the exploratores, spies or scouts. It's a clearly stated antecedent that qui is referring back to, plus a subjunctive verb, viderent. This is a relative clause of purpose. Someone has sent the scouts ahead in order that viderent, in order that they might see, or for the purpose of seeing. Okay, so this is a relative clause of purpose. It's expressing the purpose for which the scouts were sent ahead. So what we have so far would say, he, she, or it sent ahead scouts so that they might see, or for the purpose that they might see. So now the question is, to see what? And finally, we have an indirect question. That's quas in partes iter facerent. So in partes, just as in number 14, it means in directions or perhaps into parts of a place. So it could be into parts of something or in directions. It's not fully clear. Probably it's referring to geographical parts, into what parts of a region, something like that. And it's got quas along with it, so it's into what parts. And then iter facerent is they are making a march, or just they are marching. Facerent is imperfect subjunctive because it's encased within an indirect question. So we have an indirect question encased within a relative clause of purpose encased within the main sentence. So 3 layers of the onion to unpeel there, to peel back. So number 15 says, he sent ahead scouts to see in what directions or into what parts they were marching. Let's go on now to section 496. That's our Caesar reading for this lesson. It's the last part of chapter 8 of book 1. Quick review. The Helvetii had sent ambassadors to Julius Caesar asking permission for the Helvetii to cross over into Roman territory in order to take a shortcut and to have an easier journey. And Julius Caesar said that he needed some time to think about it and that they should come back later. Of course, that was a ruse or a trick. He had already decided that he did not want them to come in. We're talking about an enormous number of people here. So, again, he sends them away, telling them to come back later. And he uses that time to build fortifications and to collect up troops. So while they think he's thinking it over and considering their request, he's really just making preparations for war. In other words, he just said that to buy time, we might say. So now some time has passed and the Helvetian ambassadors are coming back to Caesar as he told them to do. They're coming back to hear his decision. And spoiler alert, he says that he's not going to let them come through. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's jump in here to line 1. Let's take the first line up through the word venit. Ubi ea dies quam constituerat cum legatiis venit. I've mentioned to you that the word ubi can mean where or when. Here it means when. It's a temporal clause talking about a time. So ubi means when, dies means day, and venit means came. That's perfect tense. So when the day came, dies is being modified by ea. That's a feminine form of is ea id. The word dies is from the 5th declension. It can be masculine or feminine. If it just means a day in general, it's masculine, apparently. And if it means an appointed day, like a certain time, perhaps a special day or a specially appointed time, then it can be feminine. And that's what we have here, because we have a relative clause, quam constituerat cum legatis. Constituerat is the verb constituo, which means to establish, determine. Here we might say appoint. So quam is a relative pronoun, and dies is the antecedent. Constituerat is pluperfect. So the first few words here say, when the day which he had established, or when the day which he had appointed. Here, in my opinion, ea does not have a very strong demonstrative force. We could say, when that day arrived, or even worse, when this day arrived. That's not nearly as good. So if you want, you can say, when that day arrived. But for me, ea here does not have a very strong demonstrative force. So I think the best way to render it into English would be simply with the definite article the. So when the day which he had established, cum legatis means with the ambassadors. He worked it out with the ambassadors, in other words. And then venit, again, refers to dies. So when the day which he had appointed with the ambassadors came, and we might move it around a little bit for better English word order. When the day came which he had appointed with the ambassadors. Moving on to the next clause. Et legati ad eum reverterunt. The legati are the ambassadors. Ad eum means to him, to Julius Caesar. That's, again, a form of is ea id. And reverterunt means returned. That's perfect tense. So when the day came which he had determined or appointed with the ambassadors, and the ambassadors returned to him, blah, blah, blah happened. That's the structure here. And we have a sudden switch to historical present with negat. That's the verb nego, which means to deny or to say no to something. So let's read a little further. Negat se more et exemplo populi Romani posse iter uli per provinciam dare. Again, negat means to deny or say no. It's third person singular. It's referring to Julius Caesar. So he denies or he says no, and that launches us into indirect speech. Whenever you have indirect speech, you need a subject accusative, and that's se, a reflexive pronoun, and then you need an infinitive to be the verb, and that's posse. So negat, se, and posse together will say, he denies that he is able, or he says no that he is able, in the sense of he says that he is not able. So we could translate it as he denies that he is able, or he says that he is not able. Either way works fine. Next we have more, which is the third declension noun mos mores. It means custom. We've seen that in the term mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors, or the tradition of the ancestors. And it's ablative singular, so it means something like in accordance with the custom. So more is ablative. We'll translate it as in accordance with the custom. And then exemplo, that's also ablative. We'll say for that, in accordance with the precedent. We could translate exemplo as example, and that would be fine. Precedent works just as well. Something that has already been done in the past. We're talking about traditions and their normal way of doing things. So what Caesar is saying here is that letting the Helvetii barge in to Roman territory would be against the Roman way of doing things, against Roman custom. So what that gives us so far is he denies that he is able, or he says that he is not able, in accordance with the custom and precedent. And then we have populi Romani, of the Roman people. And a complementary infinitive working with posse is dare. That means to give. It's the present infinitive of do. The direct object of dare is iter. So he denies that he is able to give a root in the sense of grant, to give in the sense of allow or grant. And iter, we might say path or route, perhaps. So the idea is he says that he is not able to grant a path or to grant a passage. Perhaps that might be a good way to word it. Per provinciam means through the province. Again, that's referring to the Roman province known as Provincia or Gallia Narbonensis. We have a naughty nine adjective here. That's uli. That's ulus, ula, ulum, which means any, A-N-Y. Again, it's a naughty nine adjective. Therefore, uli is dative singular. So uli means to any. So he denies that he is able to grant a path or to grant passage, uli, to anybody through the province in accordance with the custom and precedent of the Roman people. Moving on to the next clause. Et si vim facere conintur, prohibitorum ostendit. Here we have some understood words that we need to supply. This is a conditional. Remember that the two parts of a conditional are the protasis and the apodosis. And come to think of it, this conditional is actually an indirect speech. So it starts from ostendit. The verb ostendo means to point out or show or indicate. And so here he's pointing out to the ambassadors, and therefore he's saying things to them. And since he's talking, we could treat this as indirect speech. Either way, it's going to have an accusative plus infinitive kind of construction. So ostendit, he points out, and then prohibitorum is a future active participle. It's in the accusative case. There's an understood say here. See on line 2 where it says negat se, we need to reuse that word say there, that reflexive pronoun. So ostendit plus an understood se would say this. He points out that he, and then we have prohibitorum, and then we need to supply the word esse. Prohibitorum and esse together will be a future infinitive. Prohibitorum is a future active participle. Esse is an infinitive. They join forces to form a future active infinitive. Why do we need a future active infinitive? Because we have indirect speech, or at the very least, an accusative plus infinitive construction. So ostendit se prohibitorum esse we'll say, he points out that he will stop them. Prohibiturum. Prohibeo is the verb there. It means to restrain, to stop, to hold back, to block, something like that. Prevent might be a good way to translate it. So he points out that he will prevent, or he points out that he will stop. And there's an understood direct object, stop them or stop it, meaning the process of them coming over the river. So this is kind of a compact way to state this. With prohibiturum and ostendit, we have to think of se being there. We have to think of esse being there. We have to think of a direct object of whatever is being stopped or prevented. So prohibiturum ostendit. He points out that he will prevent them, or he points out that he will stop them. Again, prohibiturum plus esse is a future infinitive. Now let's examine the fact that it's a conditional. We have si vim facere conintur. Conintur is a present tense subjunctive form of the verb conor, which means to try or attempt. That is the first ingredient you need for a future less vivid construction. So this is a future less vivid conditional. So the idea here is si conintur, if they should try. Remember that a future less vivid is a should-would kind of construction. So if they should do this, he would do that. That sort of structure. So si and conintur will say, if they should try, or if they should attempt, and then a complementary infinitive, facere, means to do or make, and then vim in the singular means violence or force. So literally, if they should try to do violence, or if they should try to make violence, or perhaps to use force, let's translate it that way. Let's say, if they should try to use force, and then we have prohibiturum. So he points out that if they should try to use force, he will stop them. So this is not exactly a normal kind of conditional, because part of it is in indirect speech. And in fact, you could analyze this by saying that everything from et to ostendit is technically indirect speech. And then si vim facere conintur is a subordinate clause within indirect speech. And according to the rules of Latin grammar, any subordinate clause within indirect speech is supposed to have a subjunctive verb. So you could just treat it like conintur has to be subjunctive because it's in a subordinate clause within indirect speech. Or you could think of si vim facere conintur as the protasis of a conditional, and then prohibiturum as the apodosis. But again, it's inside indirect speech, so prohibiturum has to be an infinitive. To my knowledge, there's no way in Latin to make a subjunctive infinitive. So I don't know how an infinitive can be subjunctive. There's no way really to do that. So we just simply have esse being supplied along with prohibiturum. So regardless of how you slice it, regardless of how you analyze it, the thing that Caesar is saying to them is this. He points out that if they should try to use force, that he will stop them. And we could even use the word would in English to give it a little bit of a subjunctive flavor. We could say, he points out that if they should try to use force, that he would stop them. That makes it sound a little bit more like a conditional. Moving along to the next clause. Helvetii easpe deiecti. So here we have the response of the Helvetii. The Helvetii is the subject, and then easpe deiecti. Deiecti is a perfect passive participle working here as an adjective modifying Helvetii. That's de plus yakio. Yakio means to throw or cast. And de means down here, I think. So de yakio means to cast down. So if you're dejecti, you're downcast. And we even have the English word dejected that comes directly from this word. So helvetii and dejecti, those two words together say the helvetii, dejected or downcast, and then easpe is ablative. It says something like, with respect to this hope or in this hope. Spe is the third declension noun space, which means hope. Ea is a form of id. So for dejecti, we could say perhaps disappointed. And then for easpe, we could say in this hope. The helvetii, disappointed with respect to this hope, or the helvetii, disappointed in this hope. Moving along, we have navibus junctis, ratibusque compluribus factis. By the way, this is all one sentence going to the end of the reading to the word destiterunt. So we have lots of little parts here. The part we're in now is a big ablative absolute. So navibus junctis. Navibus is the third declension noun navis, which means ship. And junctis, that's the verb jungo, which means to join together. We see it in words like conjunction, junction, injunction, things like that. So navibus junctis says ships having been joined. And ratibusque, that's the third declension noun ratis, which means raft. And it's in the ablative plural, so it's ratibus with the que ending. So navibus and junctis together say, with ships having been joined. Then we have ratibusque compluribus factis. That's another ablative absolute, but it's another sense unit. So ratis, the third declension noun ratis, means raft, and factis is facio. So ratibus and factis means rafts having been made. Ratibus is ablative plural. It's got the que ending, which supplies the word and. So that gives us and after the word junctis. With ships having been joined and rafts having been made. And it's not just a few rafts, it's compluribus, very many rafts. Pluribus, just by itself, would mean many, but with com, that intensifies it, so it's very many. Plures is a comparative adjective. It's the word plus, which means more. So it's like saying many, but even more than many. So it has the idea of very many, and then it's intensified even further with com. That's really con. The N in con changes to an M. So compluribus means very many. We could read compluribus with navibus, or we could read it just with ratibus. So it could say something like, with many ships having been joined, and with many rafts having been made. Or we could just read compluribus with ratibus only, and say, with ships having been joined, and many rafts having been made. Where are we going with all this? What is all this taking us to? All this talk about ships joined together, rafts having been made. What is all this taking us to? Well, they're trying an alternate way to get across the river. The Helvetii have been denied permission by Caesar to come across in a peaceful way, and so now they're trying to use different sketchy methods to get across the river. They're trying to just sort of barge in, no pun intended. They're trying to barge into Roman territory, literally, by building some alternate way to get across the river. Remember that a couple of readings ago, there had been a bridge near the city of Genoa, but Julius Caesar ordered it to be ripped down. So the bridge that was there is now gone. There are lots of fortifications on the south side of the river, but the Helvetii are still going to try to come across. So they're putting together rafts, making sort of a makeshift bridge. They're putting boats together. They're just trying to find any way to come across. All this eventually takes us to desteterunt at the very end. The subject of this long sentence on line 4, or at the end of line 4 and beginning of line 5, is helvetii, and the verb is desteterunt. That means to cease, to stop. In English, we have the word desist. If you stop doing something, you desist from doing it. So this entire sentence is sandwiched in between helvetii and desteterunt. So the helvetii desist, or really it's perfect tense. So the helvetii desisted. And then the rest of the sentence tells us all the stuff they tried to do before they stopped, before they ceased. And then hoc konatu, that's ablative, basically ablative of separation. Konatus is a fourth declension noun that means attempt, and hoc is also ablative along with it. So we can translate hoc konatu as from this attempt. They ceased from this attempt. Therefore, hoc konatu is ablative of separation. On line 8, we have posent and konati. Konati is a perfect tense participle of the verb konor. Remember that konor is deponent, so a perfect tense participle ordinarily would be a perfect passive participle, but for a deponent verb, really it's a perfect active participle. So we can translate konati, that's agreeing with helvetii, we can translate konati as having tried or having attempted. Then we have si perrumpere posent. We saw this in one of our exercises. Konati here means seeing if they can do it, trying out, testing it out to see if they can do it. That's the idea. So konati and then si and posent says having tried to see if they might be able perrumpere, to burst through. Rumpo means to break, and then per means through, so literally to break through. So si perrumpere posent konati, having tried to see if they were able to break through, or in more colloquial English, having tried to see if they could break through. And then later, desteterunt, they desisted, they stopped. But they're trying different ways to get across. Now let's talk about alii, wadis, rodani. Wadis is the second declension neuter noun wadum, which means ford. Ford in the sense of a shallow place where you can cross a river on foot. Remember, the bridge has been torn down, so they can't use the bridge. They're trying to figure out alternate ways to get across. So wadis is by means of fords, and then rodani is of the Rhone. So what's alii doing here? Alii means other. It's alias, alia, alium. It means other. If you look in an English translation for this passage, it will say that some people were trying to get across with the ships joined together, the rafts having been made, while others try to get across by fords of the Rhone. So alii here has the idea of some people are trying this, some people are trying that. It's not fully clear in the Latin. I personally, to translate it that way, I would want to have another alii, perhaps before nawibus, but we only have the word alii once. So how do we translate alii? We could say some people by means of fords of the Rhone, or other people by means of fords of the Rhone, with the idea that some people tried the ships, joined together, others tried the ford or fords. We could do it a couple of different ways, but that's what is happening in the Latin. Next we have qua minima altitudo fluminis erat. Altitudo is similar to our English word altitude, which means height, in the sense of how high you are. Remember that in Latin, altus, alta, altum can mean high, or when you're talking about water, it can mean deep. And here we're talking about a river. So altitudo as a noun means height or depth. And so here it means depth. So minima altitudo means the least depth. Fluminus means of the river, that's genitive, and then erat means was. Qua is an adverbial form. We studied it a while back. It's not exactly a relative pronoun. It means something like where or in the place which. Let's just translate it as where. So qua minima altitudo fluminus erat will say where the least depth or smallest depth of the river was, or perhaps where there was the smallest depth or least depth of the river. Now Caesar is going to tell us when they tried to do it. Non and numquam together literally say not never. So if something is not never, it means sometimes. That's a common Roman idiom to put two negatives together like that. It's called litotes. According to the online dictionary I'm looking at, you can pronounce it as litotes or litotes, but it's spelled litotes. And it's when you express something using two negatives. So that's the poetic device that's being used here with non numquam. It's litotes. So not never means some or sometimes. Interdiu means by day in the sense of during the daytime. And then noctu means by night. Saipius is a comparative adverb. Saipe means often, and therefore saipius as a comparative adverb would mean more often. So he's saying sometimes during the day, but more often at night. That's when they would try to cross over. We have another participle modifying the helvetii. That's repulsi. That's the verb pello, which means to push or strike, perhaps. And then re means back. We have our English word repulse and also repulsive. So if something's repulsive, it strikes you back or pushes you back. You want to just sort of recoil away from it. So repulsi is a perfect passive participle modifying helvetii. So it means having been thrown back, having been struck back, having been repelled. Munitione is ablative of means. It means by the fortification. So they're repelled or driven back by the fortification. And then you have operis. That's genitive singular. It means of the work in the sense of the fortifications that they built. We might say earthworks. You know, they dug a ditch and then they put the dirt next to the ditch to create a wall. So the idea here is they were repelled by the fortification of the earthworks. That's the idea. And by the concursu. Concursus is a fourth declension noun. As you can see in the footnotes, it means charge or onset. Militum is genitive plural. That means of the soldiers. And concursu, again, is ablative of means. So they're repelled by the fortification of the earthwork or earthworks and by the attack of the soldiers or the charge of the soldiers. One more ablative of means, that's telis. That's the second declension noun, talum, which means something like a javelin or some kind of missile that you can throw in combat. We can translate it as spear. So 3 ablatives of means here, telling us how they are repulsi. So they are repelled by the fortification of the earthwork and by the charge of the soldiers and by the spears. So let's try the whole sentence starting from line 4 from helvetii. And we'll need to change around the word order a bit to put it into a good English word order. So starting at the very end of line 4, we'll say, the Helvetii, disappointed in this hope. Then we'll jump to Konati, having tried to see if they could break through. Ships having been joined together, and very many rafts having been made, some by means of fords of the Rhone, where the least depth of the river was, sometimes by day, more often by night. Then we could go all the way to the end and say they ceased from this attempt, having been repulsed by the fortification of the earthwork and by the charge of the soldiers and by spears. So that was actually a pretty challenging sentence there. Again, I would have preferred to have the word alii there twice. I'm not sure why it's just there once, but, Julius Caesar knows more about how to write good Latin than I do. So we did the best we could, and I hope you found that helpful. Again, thanks for sticking with me through that tough passage. This brings us to the end of yet another episode of Lenny's Latin class. Thanks for sticking with me. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again in the next lesson, which is lesson 65.